Welcome back to The Sideline. I'm Rory Jones, and today I'll be reflecting on one of the biggest stories in recent months, the Luis Rubiales scandal, how it led to what is now being referred to as Spain's Me Too movement, and what's next for Spanish women's football. For those of you who perhaps live under a rock, it began on August the 20th. Spain defeated England 1-0 to bring home their first ever World Cup title in front of 75,000 fans at Sydney's Accor Stadium. The maiden goal being provided by Real Madrid's Olga Carmona. But instead of reminiscing on Carmona's heroics, the sequence of events that followed would shift the lens onto the former president of the Spanish FA, Luis Rubiales. During the trophy presentation, he gave a kiss to Spain forward Jenni Hermoso, an act which the player has since said was not consensual. Despite calls for resignation, Rubiales was adamant that he had done nothing wrong, famously giving a speech on August the 25th where he repeated, and this will be terrible Spanish pronunciation, but no voy a dimitir, Spanish for I will not resign. On September the 10th, however, Rubiales would eventually step down after Hermoso filed a legal complaint against him for sexual assault on September the 8th. FIFA has also decided to intervene, banning Rubiales from all football-related activity for 3 years. In the midst of this scandal, the hashtag Se Acabó has been trending across Spain, translating as it's over. The sequence of events has been regarded as something of an awakening in the country, which runs much deeper than the football pitch. For today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Middleton, a journalist at The News Movement, who has been covering this story. Among other things, today's guest is also a fellow City journalism grad, and she's also a United fan too. So, Emma, welcome to The Sideline. I'm going to get straight into it, really. What's next for Spanish women's football?
I think, well, firstly, Rory, the pronunciation was flipping brilliant that you did a second ago. And also that timeline was very comprehensive as well. I think you've stolen my thunder there because I'd mapped out a really long timeline, but I think you've just pretty much covered it all. The single answer to that is change. And I think hopefully in this episode, we'll tap a little bit more into the context of what happened, because as you've just described in that timeline, those are the series of events that really happened over the course of like 4 weeks. And actually, the pre-context to all of this was actually, since 2015, a real kind of sense of unhappy Spain women camp. And this event is almost like the cherry on the cake, or I guess the straw that broke the camel's back, because obviously it wasn't a happy moment. It was clearly a moment that signified that enough is enough, as we've seen with the Se Acabó hashtag. And moving forward, what is really going to be the difference and what's next? Well, that is going to be change. And hopefully this moment and this whole momentum that's built around this campaign now, but also the support from around the world shows that really the only way forward now for Spain is to change its structure, but also to recognise that this is a broader issue than just Spain itself, and that lots of fellow footballers, lots of fellow sportswomen have also felt the same.
You mentioned this being a broader issue, which definitely seems to have gone far beyond the football pitch. What do you think the Rubiales scandal and the ongoing fallout as well over the last, almost 3 months now? What do you think that tells us about women's football, both in Spain and globally as well?
I don't think this controversy can be viewed without the context of the Spanish women's football over the past few years. And I think most people will agree that it was been completely sort of tumultuous. A lot's happening. And this incident, as I've just mentioned, was really the final straw. And I mentioned 2015 a minute ago. And the reason why I did that was because that was the first time the Spain had qualified for the Women's World Cup. But it was also the time when they were knocked out at the group stages. And a lot of people found that very disappointing. Obviously, it was seen as, well, the Spain had made it to the World Cup, but, why didn't they get further? And I know, obviously, after every World Cup, you go through this sort of big diagnostic about, what happened to the team and all of this. But what can't be ignored is the context of kind of the players being unhappy in the Spain camp. And I'm going to mention the national team coach here, Ignacio Carrera, and he'd been called up by several players for some of his actions, which were seen as misogynistic. There was instance reported by The Athletic about him asking players, if they want to get off the bench to show more cleavage. And it really paints this picture of a Spanish team that was being run by men. It was a women's team being run by men, and clearly the women weren't happy with how it was being run. I'm not trying to conflate like, poor World Cup form to that, but I don't think you can see those as separate issues. And then obviously Carrera was then to be replaced by Vilda, and obviously Vilda went on to lift the trophy with Spain, with Spain women, which is obviously a huge success. But I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the cherry on the top. It was the moment that Spain women had all been waiting for. Under Vilda, Spain women had refused to play. They'd refused to be called up to the national team because, again, this problem of misogyny, how the team was being run, the conditions, the treatment, all of that. They won the Women's World Cup, but that had to be a moment when things started to change, which is weird if you think about it. A national team's just won a World Cup. That's huge. Their first one. I mean, and again, we'll talk about this later, but what should have been such a huge moment in terms of celebration and all of that turned into something that really wasn't. But I think what the Rubiales scandal really says about the fallout in Spain was that this has a backstory, that this was the moment that eventually made people wake up to the fact of what was happening in Spain. And then obviously more globally as well, I just think it tells us, if we look at the support from the other players, not even players, but actors, celebrities, women all around the world, that this is a problem that doesn't just exist in football, and it actually is a picture of something that exists in other industries. It happens in other sports, and hopefully this moment, it's the case that hopefully will wake up lots of boards, lots of other structures in companies to realise that women will no longer kind of take the attitudes and the way in which a lot of kind of particularly women's teams have been run in the past. I mean, you look at things, a really underreported case was Slovenia, which people haven't heard about, and they wrote a similar letter to their federation saying they were unhappy with how the team was run. It was, they received racist comments, misogynistic comments, homophobic comments. All of those little things clearly need to go, and the Rubiales scandal was just that moment in time when women decided, right, this is enough.
Certainly sounds like it. I think also thinking back to the 2023 Women's World Cup this year, it really was a tournament that should be celebrated for a number of milestones as well. I think there was almost 2 million spectators throughout the tournament, which absolutely shattered the previous record. I think it was by almost like 600,000 as well on the last attendance high, which was at Canada in 2015. You also look at it being the first ever World Cup to be staged in the Southern Hemisphere. And obviously Australia being such a huge market for women's football, having one of the world's best teams too. And then you kind of you look at it also being the first World Cup to feature 32 teams as well. So you look at the expansion of the game. Do you think it's quite unfortunate in that case that the Rubiales scandal has almost cast a cloud over some of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the first answer has to be yes, doesn't it? Because there was such a build up to this tournament. It's almost just like 2023 was the year that women's sport was going to receive this kind of launch pad to becoming a huge global phenomenon. And as you just mentioned, it was the biggest women's sport tournament ever. And obviously that shouldn't be taken away, but no one can deny it's cast a cloud over it. I mean, and even Rubiales is regretful of this himself. I mean, in the interview that he did with Piers Morgan, which was the first time he'd really spoken out to the media since the incident happened on the 20th of August, he quote unquote said it gives him an incredible amount of sadness that there has been this cloud that's been cast over Spain's huge success. And clearly he didn't want that either, because his federation clearly believes they've achieved a great milestone with Spain lifting the Women's World Cup, considering they'd never qualified for a World Cup before 2015. I mean, in the space of 8 years or so, they've become one of the best women's football teams in the world. And that's, you can't take that away. I also think it's regretful in a way that the media moved on so quickly to the Rubiales scandal and didn't necessarily focus on Spain's win. I mean, on that Sunday of the World Cup final, it almost seemed, and I was reporting actually at Wembley Park at the time, and clearly everyone was, the headlines were obviously that Spain had lifted the Women's World Cup, but really within 24 hours, everyone had just moved on to this controversy, because clearly that was the juicy headline, and obviously it's what people are gonna click on. But then obviously, kind of to caveat all of that, the more positive answer is that the fan base that the Women's World Cup has built won't go away, and it's created this legacy. It's these fans, the next generation, that are going to take women's football forward. So even though it did, yeah, of course, it did cast a cloud. The cloud, when that does lift and when things do become clearer, the case is settled. Hopefully, it'll be positive in the sense that things have changed, but also the fans in Spain and around the world that were kind of mobilised by Spain's win won't go away. And in a way, they've probably waken up even more to the kind of what some female footballers have been going through. And it's a terrible thing to say, because obviously you never want someone to get a profile of something that's happened to them, and clearly it's affected Jenni mentally as well. She's recently spoken out about how she's been speaking to a psychologist, and she has found it, she's received threats and it's all been very difficult, but ultimately it has given Spain women a much greater profile. And again, it's a bit awkward to talk about that because it's come through clearly a time of trauma and great stress. But at least more people will be able to empathise with their situation. So I think, what I'm trying to say is that, it did cast a cloud, but ultimately people are still remembering what happened. And it's also brought in, I guess, people that are adjacent to football and don't follow football. It's kind of brought them into this whole conversation. Even if they follow the news and not football, they will now have heard of Jenni Hermoso, Rubiales, and equally the broader context of really what goes on a lot of the time in women's football.
I mean, you've mentioned how far this has gone, that the scale that this has, and to the extent where it's almost been dubbed as the Spanish Me Too movement, if you like, with the Se Acabó hashtag then trending as a result of this. How can this scandal, in your view, how can this be used as a catalyst for positive change, both in women's football and also in society as a whole? You mentioned that there's definitely a positive behind this, and this can certainly have a positive outcome in the future.
Yeah, I think the very broad point to make is that from seeing what's happened in the aftermath, it's about removing this kind of fear of change. I mean, I think the most stark, really kind of incident in that kind of 8-week period since the incident happened was Jorge Vilda being sacked, because and that would have shocked a lot of the world, because what a lot of people would see was this World Cup winning coach who was brought on a squad across a few years, and despite all the kind of the backstory and the unrest within Spain's women's football team, he helped achieve a World Cup title, and then yet the federation do decide to tell him to leave, which for some people were like, how? Why has that happened? Because he's a success. He's got on a CV. It looks pretty good. But also, I think what that says is that when you've got such ingrained problems, you've got unhappiness, and you've got the players that don't want to cooperate anymore with the federation or the broader setup, then you really have a problem. And even though you've got success, if that's just papering over so many more problems, then things have to change. And hopefully, why I mentioned that Vilda is because that's like almost an anecdote that can be used as a catalyst for change in other sports. That just because an athlete, if they've got a coach, just because they're very successful, doesn't mean that athlete can therefore step up and say, I'm unhappy with how my coach and my management are being run. I want a change. It might be that a team, high up in a league table somewhere in any women's sport, yet they don't like how they're being coached. They feel they're being mistreated. That hopefully gives a lot of female athletes a platform to say, hang on a sec, I don't accept this anymore. And equally, away from sport entirely, it will also give women in different industries the opportunities to say, no, we might be a very successful company, but I'm not happy with how this is. And hopefully what that will lead us to is, and Hermoso's spoken about this before, in the sense that she's not calling for sort of some great sort of like feminist takeover here. It's actually just calling for some sort of equality between men and women, particularly in football. And I think sometimes that's kind of misunderstood, that the catalyst for positive change isn't a catalyst for women's football to overtake men's football. It's not for women's sport to somehow, subjugate men's sport. It's just for women to have an equal platform to men, be valued and coached and respected in the same way as men, and celebrated in the same way as men.
That's definitely one of the main talking points, and definitely one of the most interesting aspects for me. Certainly following it, I see Spain win the World Cup, and mindful of the head coach that took them there, and I think it's a huge statement that Vilda, his departure really kind of, I think it speaks volumes, and I think it's certainly as someone who perhaps doesn't, I think perhaps doesn't follow women's football as closely as someone like yourself does. I think it's certainly an eye opener when you see that a coach that literally brings his team to the pinnacle of the sport is dismissed, and I think a large part of that was his kind of response to the Rubiales incident as well. Do you think it is a positive sign in that case that players are now kind of, unlike a statement, that players are now able to make themselves heard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the past, I think what's been a struggle to make themselves heard. Now players kind of can make themselves heard louder. They've got social platforms. I mean, if you look at the Lionesses now, I mean, and look at Spain's national team, obviously now. I mean, I don't have the statistics about how much kind of their Instagram profiles have grown since then, but I'm pretty sure, Hermoso and other players' Instagrams have absolutely shot up since then. I think people now have the platform, the players now have the platform to call things out. I think they're now surrounded by staff that hopefully can help them call things out. I think it's also important to recognise, though, that without male kind of allyship, a lot of these messages can't be heard as well. And I think a lot of people listening might disagree with me in the sense that, they might think, oh, women's sport can stand alone. It doesn't need the help of men. But I mean, I would disagree with that, because I think it's just as important to have men on board as it is women on board with this to achieve some sort of parity. But to your point, I do think they've got more of a platform now. They've got players that will back them up. They've got staff that will back them up. And equally, now the fan base is bigger. They'll have fans that will back them up. And both you and I know that how crucial fans are to sport, and particularly football in general. Without fans, football wouldn't be a thing. So I think out of all of this, having your fans and which quite frankly, women's football didn't have, 10 years ago, having those fans now will also help bring about the change, because they won't stand for seeing their players and their team, going through what clearly, Hermoso's been through.
I think also if we could talk about some of the men's reactions, I think, or the high profile ones to the scandal. I think back to Sevilla, the men's team wearing t-shirts featuring the Say Acabo messaging across them. I think that was pretty early on as well. I think that was within a few days of it happening, and I think also you have the Spanish men's national team kind of collectively condemning Rubiales' actions on September the 4th. And that was actually very close to his resignation. I think that was 6 days, according to my timeline. I think that's 6 days before he resigned. So it clearly will have had a huge impact as well. I mean, and then I think back to legendary Spanish footballers such as Sergio Ramos, also condemning Rubiales. I think he also was of the opinion that he didn't want that to detract from kind of, to annotate what he said in Spanish, from sort of the great thing that Spain, the women's team, were world champions. So I think it's definitely an encouraging sign to think to see the response from significant male figures in Spanish football as well.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought this up, because I just think it's so important. I mean, I started kind of talking about male allies in just a minute ago, but it's I can't stress enough how important it is to have these men kind of players, and maybe not players at all, former players, whoever they might be, standing up and supporting the women. Because the reality, even though I mentioned that a lot of these female players have much bigger platform than they did, they still don't have a bigger platform as the men do. And again, you might, there are going to be people that disagree with what I say here, in the sense, women can bring about change, and growth by themselves. And I just think, I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think it'll take longer. And I also think, it'll bring a different audience to women's football if you have these male players standing up, because even if you don't engage with the women's game whatsoever and you do engage with the men's game, you'll be seeing the same messaging in both. And therefore, A, there's some relatability between the two games, but B, you might stop and start taking notice if you think that, someone you've idolized is now wanting to speak on a certain cause. And I think it's the same that goes for any celebrities that have ever joined any movement in the past, really, that, the way the world works is that it gets more cut through when someone that you relate to speaks about something perhaps you don't relate to. But then when you understand it more because they've profiled the issue, you become curious about it and then you learn more. And I think that's really important. It's not just about profiling that that wearing Sea Cabo on the shirts does, but it's also about helping people learn what that really means, why they're doing it. Clearly the male players understand that, the Sea Cabo messaging. It's not just they've, been given it by the PR team and just say, whack these shirts on, because, you wouldn't do that. So they've clearly collectively come together and decided this is an important thing for them to get behind. And hopefully that will sort of communicate to a much broader male audience than it would just do if it exists with female players putting the same on their shirts.
Definitely. I mean, kudos to Sophia for doing that. I'm sure they weren't the only team or the only athletes who were supporting, but I think the fact that they did it so early on and so publicly, I think it's a fantastic statement. And also, when you do mention players from other sports as well, it does remind me of sort of you think of. It reminds me of when I think of Sir Andy Murray, when I think he corrected a journalist a couple of times when he was asked about some sort of feat, and he was like, "No, that's the first this would be the first male sportsman to do this, because you've had a female player who's done it all before in Serena Williams." And I think it's definitely an encouraging thing to see, certainly when people are using their platform in a way that is authentic as well, and it's not like a contrived PR marketing stunt. It's like an actual. No, this person is choosing to do this. They're choosing to use their platform to make a real positive statement and kind of make themselves heard, and draw light on other issues that doesn't necessarily even affect them, but affect society as a whole.
And I think, as on that point with Andy Murray, lots of people would have been like, "Oh, that's just so it's pedantic," and he didn't need to. He didn't need to correct the reporter when they said, it's the first. I can't remember what now was the first, player to get X number of titles, and he corrected and said first male player. And as I say, a lot of people would have said, "Oh, that's just pedantic and sort of causing trouble." But if people don't make those minor corrections now, they just become ingrained. I mean, they already are ingrained. So full credit to Andy Murray for calling that out, and the same goes here with Ser Cabo, even just standing up and supporting Hermoso, because it's those small little gestures that actually make a huge difference. I mean, it wasn't just obviously the male players that were standing up for Hermoso. There was lots of teams in the NWSL that were wearing wristbands with Ser Cabo on them. Support. I think it was like Contiga, Jenni Hermoso. We stand with Hermoso. And again, so what's nice is seeing that it's not just men or women actually kind of showing their support. It's actually, people, whoever you might be, coming together and recognizing here that whatever you think of what happened with that kiss, it's clearly something that needs to be talked about more and understood more so that change can be achieved.
Certainly something that it's interesting to mention the certainly American athletes. I think with the NWSL and the WNBA too, I think athletes in those leagues have been so expressive as well as by comparison. You think of what the NWSL is trying to do in terms of establishing a league that they want that to be the sort of the pantheon of women's football, or the kind of Premier League equivalent. And I kind of think that they're so much more expressive, and you kind of look at how athletes are using their platforms. I think with regards to such as Black Lives Matter and kind of visibly showing their support for these broader issues. Do you think there's an element of that in some sense? It's kind of players, the theme of female athletes really using their platform, and that's definitely something we can see in Spanish women's football, perhaps in the future, in some ways similar to how we've seen in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, NWSL is almost like it's the Premier League, and it's the one to beat, because what a lot of people don't realise is that most teams in the NWSL actually are standalone teams. They don't have a men's equivalent, whereas obviously the setup that we have here in the UK, most WSL teams are affiliated with a men's team. So the NWSL is almost like the shining star of an example of what a women's league could be, and obviously the profits that women's football can make. I think, that's far ahead of perhaps where Spain is at the moment, where even I guess where the WSL is at the moment. But that's not to say they're not on the same trajectory now. And obviously this World Cup win was huge for Spain. And obviously, I'm very much hope things go that way.
Wouldn't be a silent episode without me somehow talking about the United States at some point. But
They're going to have to sneak in there somewhere, aren't they?
I had to sneak it in, and Real Madrid as well. I have no idea why, but every episode they have Real Madrid has come up. So I've kept that thing going as well. They're rent free in my head apparently. But I think coming back to sort of some of the reactions to Rubiales, I think it's certainly positive when you do see some of the real figureheads in Spanish football as well. You think of Real Madrid president Florentino Perez. You think of La Liga president Javier Tebas, and also Barcelona's president. This is Catalan, so I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation as well, but I think it's Joan Laporta. So they've all condemned Rubiales' action. You also still do have some of these figures as well in high places, such as Atletico Madrid's president, Enrique Careso. He had kind of a bit of a different response to this when he was quoted as saying, I don't know who should apologise to whom, whether it's Luis Rubiales to Jenni Hermoso or the other way round. And I think obviously it's not, it's a bit of a kind of jaded response, I suppose. But do you think this scandal in judging some of these reactions, do you think this scandal is kind of exposing a deeper societal issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of Enrique Cerezo, I think to kind of opt out of making a statement, it is a bit odd when everyone else kind of around the whole, a lot of people around you are. I don't want to read too much into it, but I think it's kind of a case of perhaps someone not quite understanding the situation. And again, I'm hesitant to kind of explain why he said that and why he didn't just kind of make or even say and explain his point. But it's clearly deep seated in this wider, as you say, structural issue in Spain, where I think clearly we need to get everyone on the same page here. And this was just kind of showing that a lot of people aren't on that page yet, because they have to be in order for that almost like change to come about. And I think the problem also with kind of shutting down that conversation is that the change can only come with the conversations. To step out of that conversation is just sort of ignoring the problem. And I think you've got to tackle these problems head on a little bit. So that's why I think there's an issue with that. And clearly, we've spoken about it, but clearly there is a long structural issue. And we go back to Spain's team under Ignacio Carrera, and there were so many problems there, and it's taken so long for an incident like this to cause the change. It's almost just like this has been squashed under the carpet for like 10 years, and still the fact that people aren't quite recognizing that it's taken 15 players in the Spain's team last year to boycott the national side and say I won't be called up. It's taken this incident with the Rubiales kiss to actually be like, oh, okay, now we've got to restructure Spain, the Spanish football. And really, it shouldn't have taken. Obviously, it's a huge positive thing now, but it should not have taken this long to recognise there was a problem here. And the problem was the female players weren't being listened to. And even though there was a bit of a media kind of, the media all jumped on the story last year about 15 Spain's players, refusing to be called up. It wasn't enough also to generate the change. And I know it was ahead of the Women's World Cup, and I know the federation were probably reluctant to make those changes. But clearly, the Rubiales incident was the final thing that was like, okay, we are going to have to change something now. So going back to my point, I think with Cerezo, it wasn't right for him just to step out of it in the way he did, considering there's been such a long, sort of not ignorance hiatus in kind of bringing up this conversation. But hopefully now things can be rebuilt. Again, we'll see think we'll see kind of in the next year how they kind of start doing that. I mean, they've started doing that with the new appointment of Montse Tomei, the new women's head coach. It'll be very interesting to see in her direction where the team go now.
One thing that stands out to me as well, because I remember covering this at the time, was the fact that it took until I think 2020 for there to be like a real collective bargaining agreement for the players. I think back to strikes in Spanish women's football, and I know that that's I'm familiar with the one with the 15 players. Was it last year? But also in La Liga there was a player strike as well in the 2019-2020 season. So it's kind of, you are kind of wondering how are players having to go to these extremes just to make themselves heard.
And also there was the separate strike really recently with regards to pay. And again, that was separate to the Rubiales case, but equally a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, what's happening in Spain women's football? The fact that you've got this case going on and you've got the strike over equal pay. I think if I remember correctly, the players were refusing to play for their club teams. They're refusing to start the season until they'd agreed a better terms, conditions, and also pay. I mean, and also, in light of the success of the country at the Women's World Cup, you would think as well that maybe things they'd be more willing to kind of make those changes and start things slightly afresh. But it called for a strike action to do that. And again, we've seen in the case in the going back to the NWSL, because we all like to go there. But they spent many years battling for a collective bargaining agreement, obviously led largely by Megan Rapinoe. And she was obviously the figurehead of that movement. And this one seemed to be a bit more collective in that just a lot of players just said, oh, well, I'm not coming back to play for the club teams unless this is changed. And I think what's taking another step back is what's kind of so shocking is that I don't think we've ever seen that in a men's game. Haven't seen that. Even in men's sport, sort of to my knowledge, certainly in my lifetime. And again, you'll have people listening being like, well, yes, that's because men make more money, they can be paid more, so they don't have to strike. But equally, someone's got to do something to try and level this up, because unless someone makes those bold decisions to start investing in coverage, B, paying the players more and lifting the whole experience up, then things aren't going to change. Bit of a rant there, but I hope you catch my drift.
No, it wouldn't be a sideline episode without at least one rant. Usually it's me, but
I've got it out of my system now. All right, we're clear to
go. In some ways, it does seem as though the US women's football, it's kind of a model. I think, I know it sounds very cliche, but it's kind of, I think it's such a great example of what women's football can be, especially when you think of the United States as well as like. Football or soccer as they call it over there, and regrettably, I'll admit it, sometimes I call it soccer as well. But I think when you look at how the sport is over there, it's much more developed as like a women's game. And I think a lot of male athletes in the US, a lot of them will still probably prefer to play American football or basketball and so on. But I think when you look at the both on and off the field, how far they've come in terms of the development of that, in terms of obviously winning World Cups on the pitch and having players such as Rapinoe and Alex Morgan and many other household names. But I think you also look at what they're doing off the field as well. I think one team in the NWSL that jumps out at me is the Angel City. I think you look at what they're doing in terms of the ownership structure, in terms of the club structure, and even sponsorship revenue. Do you think that's definitely setting a strong example for women's club football as well, when you look at what the NWSL is doing?
Yeah, no, totally. I think, as I said, the NWSL have a very unique structure, which means that they can make change more easily because a lot of the teams aren't linked to an equivalent men's team. So I think they're a bit more dynamic, malleable in the sense that they can experiment with different ways of making kind of women's football a product which is marketable, compared to the women's teams in the UK's NWSL being a bit more perhaps restricted and tied to what the men's clubs are doing. And I'm not saying that necessarily is all a disadvantage, because there's a lot of money and funding that comes from the men's team, which is vital to support the women's team. But equally in the US, what you've got is a league that has become almost a product. I think the reason why it's been so successful is because it's a product. Those teams are separate to the men's teams. They're kind of women's football is a separate thing to men's soccer, or should I say? So they're completely different products. And then the other thing that's been so successful is obviously that they I mean, as you've mentioned, they've won, I think it's even 3 back-to-back World Cup titles. I mean, it's huge, isn't it? But also the athletes have almost become stars in their own right. So I think we're seeing that definitely now with the Lionesses, and players in the WSL. But I think, and again with Spain now, a lot of those players are household names. Like, we didn't see them like that before. But what the NWSL really have done is push those kind of names to international fame, and particularly, players like Megan Rapinoe, who are the figurehead, and they're not afraid to kind of speak out and advocate for change. Hopefully we'll see more and more of those players, sort of not just from America, but from different countries around the world, so that, as I said before, the game is leveled up. And quite frankly, I think the next World Cup in 2027 will be quite something. And I think the USA will be quaking in their boots, wondering what on earth's going to happen, particularly with the rise of these African teams, because it's super exciting.
Maybe some wishful thinking there as well, being the United States. They've dominated for such a long stretch. Maybe, but it definitely seems like every women's tournament seems to almost be kind of one upping the one before it. I think back to the women's Euro in 2022, especially, on home soil in England as well. And you think of what that did in terms of the attendance records, I think were shattered. I think that the viewership records, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they're absolutely off the charts. And you also look at the broader impacts. You see names of Leah I can't even say her name today, of Leah Williamson and of Jill Scott and many others, and you kind of think that they're such great ambassadors for the sport, but also these are names that are now becoming household names too. I think it's fantastic to see that, and I think that's something that will only continue going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you look at, again, you name check Leah Williamson and Jill Scott. I mean, Leah's obviously been out for a while with her, with her ACL injury, and kind of recently now been returned to the pitch. But she certainly hasn't become, what's cool is she certainly hasn't become sort of less of a profile or less of a celebrity because she's been away. In fact, she's probably been channeling more of her energy into doing things that, she wouldn't have had the chance to do if she was playing full time. I mean, I know she's been working with the Arsenal Foundation to do some work in developing countries. She's written her book, which she's written two books now, in fact. And yeah, I've been through those, fantastic children's books. And again with Jill Scott, she's spending her time as a pundit now, so she's trailblazing a way for female players as pundits. So yeah, absolutely. And I think, these players will become even more household names. They're featured. I think what I love to see is this kind of combination of football and like fashion. So you've got like Vogue or GQ magazine or Bazaar, anyone taking players and slapping them on the front cover, doing interviews. Because again, if I think 5 years ago, I just can't even think of instances of that happening. So to see kind of a much more profile and allowing those players. I mean, I can think of Alessia Russo. I think she did an interview with Women's Health. And there are countless other, Chloe Kelly. There are countless other examples of when, culture and football are really combining now to also give these players more of a platform. And hopefully people will kind of hear more of their story as well. And it's just an inspiration to kind of other players and women too.
I think Alessia Russo, I think she broke quite a lot of hearts this summer when she decided to leave United for Arsenal. But I think we won't talk about that. That's a sensitive topic, I think.
Yeah, let's not go there, Rory, please.
But I think talking about all this positive aspect of kind of the direction in which women's football is undoubtedly heading. Do you think that's kind of the main takeaway here in terms of when you see the Sega Cabo hashtag trending, and when you see the response to the kind of all the fallout after the Rubiales incident? Do you think it's a sign that women's sport is moving on from figures such as that?
I think it's important to not make this about kind of men versus women, or somehow women want to take over, and I think that's oftentimes the narrative that gets misunderstood about the women's game, is that like somehow this is kind of challenging the men's game, and it's gonna, the men's game's gonna go to nothing because women are now playing. I think that narrative's quite dangerous, and I think with the Say a Cabo hashtag, I think that should be viewed in the sense that it's being shared by both men and both women. It's actually a coming together, not a women are standing alone from men, because as I say, I just think that narrative gets very kind of toxic and divisive. And really around that hashtag is, swirling sentiments of feminism, global change, misogyny, but not again, it's not male bashing. It shouldn't be. I mean, it's just basically highlighting issues, and it shouldn't be about putting people down. I mean, obviously it's about calling people out, but I just don't think it should be used in that very destructive way. um I mean, I love this tweet from a Spanish journalist, and she tweeted something just in the week after the World Cup final, and she said, quote unquote, in 6 days after the World Cup final, Sia Cabo had replaced the kiss that Hermoso never consented to. And the reason why I wanted just to bring that up is because it shows just how much that hashtag lashed on, but also the extent of the global support towards what happened. And it's about that solidarity. It's about that solidarity beyond football. But again, it's not about creating division. It's just about recognizing that there needs to be change, but that we can all achieve that change together. And if people want to support that, they absolutely can talk about it, raise awareness about it, share it on your Insta stories. And hopefully, you'd think hopefully in 10 years' time, these things kind of won't even be a thing. But until that, it's about coming together, not a hashtag kind of dividing people. And again, I know that's a bit of a tangent, but I do think it was something that was really misunderstood, because I think a lot of people would have taken it, I mean, men in particular, I know a lot of them would have sort of taken it quite personally, that it was all about, men running structures in the wrong way. And I just don't think it's about that. I think it's about recognizing that we all need to come together here to have a conversation, not just a kind of overtake of a feminist conversation.
So you think unity is kind of the main theme there?
Yeah, that's totally my point. It's unity, really. And look, we're still awaiting on what happens with, the Rubiales case, and clearly the players in this whole situation, Hermoso's, spoke to GQ magazine about how much it's affected her, and as I mentioned earlier, the threat she's received. Rubiales again denies any of this, and he's, just to remind our audiences, he's been accused of sexual assault and coercion, and that's kind of in the courts at the moment. And he denies wrongdoing. But what the world, I think, should be looking at now is not necessarily just the outcome of this case. It's the conversation that it created, and that conversation should be used as a force for change and constructive conversation, not dividing men, women, or creating other kind of lines in any structures of sport, because ultimately everyone wants, I mean, I would hope that everyone wants the common good here to be to resolve this, and but b, the broader thing to recognize what we can do to change. And I think that's just listening, recognizing the conversation, and supporting and calling out things that we don't think are right. And again, the lovely old fans will always help us do that.
I do think of sort of in Spanish women's football, that some of the changes that we've already seen. I'm pretty sure the national team ditched the name Femenino from the title, for instance. But I think you see the player strike in 2019-20 in that season brought about a positive change in the end, when the result was a collective bargaining agreement which kind of changed the game for Spanish women's football. I think one takeaway in all of this is that it will bring about a broader change and a positive change, and that's kind of hopefully the future here for international women's football, not just in Spain.
And again, we've spoken about that kind of idea of this being a positive thing and not a negative thing, despite kind of perhaps the narrative being taken as a very negative thing. I do think sometimes people just need to apologise, and I know that sounds kind of a bit flippant, but in the interview that Rubiales did with Piers Morgan, that was the first time he'd really spoken to the media since this has happened. He was asked whether he wanted to apologise to Jenni, and he kind of, I think Piers asked him 3 times to give him the opportunity to apologise, and every time he kind of swerved the question, didn't really do it. And I mean, again, just for context here, he has apologised in general for his actions, and kind of, in a very broad sense, but not directly to Jenni. And I just think it's sometimes the best thing is just to kind of mutually, but both apologise. And I know, some people might think, well, he has been accused of serious wrongdoing here. But I do think this whole thing wouldn't have become quite so toxic if he just recognised that perhaps he misstepped there, perhaps he did. and that would have perhaps lessened that kind of huge, great media swirl narrative around it, and maybe it wouldn't even be in the situation it is now. But the reason it is because it's been so tumultuous in the
Yeah.
sense that he's he said this, then he said that, then he's gone back on this, then he said that. The narrative's changed so many times, and again, we saw the same with Builder. He supported Rubiales, then he didn't support Rubiales, and again, coming back to the whole question about this broader positive change, I think sometimes the kind of let's just say sorry here, and that's actually
Yeah.
try and start that positive change right from the get go. Let's just say sorry, recognize something was perhaps misunderstood, or recognize that it was wrong, and then perhaps we wouldn't have got to this stage of where we are now.
I think a large part in all of this does seem to be his sort of like resolute stance in like he's done. I mean the I'm not resigning speech, for instance. I mean, he said that about 20 times, how many times he seemingly said it. But, like, I think that really seems to have been, like, a large part. And coming back to the Piers Morgan interview as well, do you think that's kind of part of the, perhaps do you think that's how it was received in some ways, that he just didn't seem to, if he was literally asked to apologise as well, do you think he just seemed to kind of not take accountability for his actions?
The Piers Morgan interview was interesting because obviously this is an active case, and he wanted to speak in Spanish because obviously he didn't want to get anything sort of legally wrong, I guess. I thought it was interesting that he gave that interview. In the interview, he did he was quite honest. He did agree that for example, it wasn't only him kissing Hermoso on that during the awards ceremony. It was him grabbing his crotch next to the Queen, next to Spain's Queen during the celebrations. And again, he said that was wrong. I think he talked about, if I remember correctly, the culture of Spain being though different. But equally, I just think at the end of that interview, the word sorry could have just done a could have spoken a million words, but it was an interesting one to do. I just think it was quite reserved because obviously, again, as going back to my point, it was an active case, but I do think that would have just tied everything a little bit up and helped some misunderstandings, if that makes sense.
I definitely agree. I think it's certainly, to reiterate the point, I think it definitely seems like it could have been avoided through just a simple apology. For me, I think what stood out, I thought what was a bit unusual is, I think, especially when someone's a head of a I'm saying it again, a soccer federation, but to resign in that fashion, because I'm pretty sure he resigned during the interview as well. I think often that would be a very it would be a press release which has probably been read by multiple people and passed through quite a few phases before it even goes public, and it would be a very sincere document. You'd see, I don't know, official statement on Twitter or X as it's now called, or something along those lines. I think to announce it during an interview stood out to me as being just a bit, let's say, unconventional.
Yeah, it was strange because it's almost like again, I mean, what do I know? But it was almost like he'd realised the position was untenable through the interview. Well, again, which is strange because, as you say, he's the head of his federation. You would have thought there'd be a press release. It'd be very managed. I mean, look, we don't know what's gone on behind the scenes. We don't know whether he'd already given heads up that he would make that announcement during the interview. Maybe he wanted to do the interview to make that announcement because he knew it would maybe, I don't know, cut through in another way to a different audience. But as you say, I agree. I mean, it's curious, and I can't. Obviously, we don't really know what happened. It was a big move, but just as I say, he had to be very careful what he said. But equally, then to go about that and make that announcement again was just was quite crazy.
Yeah, I think certainly time will tell what happens with Rubiales, and I think the interview definitely I think it did kind of leave a few more questions as well, but I think definitely my main takeaway certainly from this conversation is more I think irrespective of what happens with Rubiales, I think there are a lot of positive outcomes that you can take from the situation. I think especially for me, I think my biggest takeaway is the Se Acabo hashtag. And that's not just me trying to practice my Spanish by repeating that two-word phrase, but also I think it's something especially we're seeing being used globally. And you see it on t-shirts, on posters, and it's I think that for me is the main message here.
I think there'll always be moments in sport where someone unfortunately has to become the figurehead of almost like an ugly side of what's really going on. It's sad that change has to happen through that way, but there is always a positive outcome from it because it'll help people talk. It'll help people recognize that things can change, that things aren't stuck, that the system that maybe we think needed oiling for years has finally been given that oil to actually go about and make a different path. And particularly, we don't want any more things holding back. We're speaking about women's football. We don't want more things holding back the growth of the women's game because 2023 overall has been fantastic for the growth of the game. We've seen record numbers everywhere. I mean, you look at the Matildas in Australia; they're absolutely flying. They're packing out stadium. People are returning. It's not just the World Cup. And I don't have the statistics for the first WSL games of the season, but I put good money on the fact that they've been, the the attendance figures have been really good. So long may that continue. And I just think there are always going to be bumps in the road that ultimately everyone thinks are, all terrible at the time, but actually, we'll look hopefully in a year's time and realise that, unfortunately, obviously it was Jenni and Hermoso that had to go through this, but it will bring about much more positive way of working in the game. It'll bring about change. And again, it will just help continue that kind of exponential rise of the women's game.
I think we've come full circle here. We started by talking about change, and I guess we finish on talking about change as well. But Emma, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today.
No, thanks so much for having me, Rory. A pleasure.
Thanks. All the best.